GDP, 60% of its GDP plus minus 2% actually is accounted for by consumption. And is this international? No, this is domestic, primarily domestic, right? Second, investment, if you look at, about 30% of India's GDP comes from investment, again, plus minus, 2-3%. That is also domestic. If you look at FDI as well, FDI around 1.5% of GDP is basically the current level of India's FDI, which is actually much smaller compared to domestic investment. That is also domestic. And government spending as a percentage of GDP is 10%. So 60 plus 30 plus 10, 100. There you have basically net exports in fact is negative. So overall, domestic factor what really account for almost the entire of India's GDP. Therefore, when we don't think rigorously about this, then we basically sort of overestimate the influence of global factors. So the bottom line of this is, if India can continue implementing good policies that avails the advantage of us being a large economy with a very large consumer base and a large investor base as well, I think we can really surmount any of the challenges that come from us.
First remark is don't go European. The first lesson is don't even try. I mean, we can see the limits of the models. I mentioned earlier at the panel the Draghi report, the former Prime Minister of Italy, who was mandated to try to see why we are so not productive. And I believe the level of taxation is an obstacle in some countries. Even though, and we'll go back to that, we should always keep in mind that tax is only a means to fund a social model. What we need to start with is, what is the social model? And that's where I'm coming to India. Don't go European, but don't remain too Indian there. I mean, your social model is fed with poverty, with hunger, with serious issues of inequalities, massive. And your tax to GDP ratio just reflects that. You are much behind the average in Africa, which is around 15%. So 1/3 below Africa. Frankly speaking, that's shocking. I mean, I was shocked when we had the prep call. And I was shocked because, by the way, India, unless I'm mistaken, but is not covered by the OECD revenue statistics. So that's not something, I was in charge of the revenue statistics and numbers in mind. And India, indeed, was never identified. You're extremely low. And don't be complacent. That's the third message. The risk today, I believe, is because of your demographic growth, because of your growth, because of the introduction of GST, the money is coming in easily. And there are also some geopolitical factors. Decoupling with China, where do you go? You go to India, it's coming easy. And when it's coming too easy, you may be complacent. Actually, we don't need to do anything. The tax commissioner, by the way, you don't really have a tax commissioner in this country. We'll go back to that. You have a tax commission, you have a board. By the way, you have two boards, indirect and direct. But they may say, well, I mean, why would we need to do anything? It's coming in. The tax to GDP ratio will increase automatically. And yes, but not to the point where you need it to be. Now, what's the right threshold? We don't know. But the IMF, the UN, the OECD, and others, our intuition, so it's not a very refined economic demonstration, but there seems to be a link between development and tax to GDP up to 18-20%. Below that, you have some exceptions. Singapore is very low and has a pretty well-advanced economy that we all envy, but below that you cannot really fund your development. So you need to be on a trajectory to probably reach the 20%, and you are extremely far from that.
That simplification is actually a need, and in that spirit, this whole exercise has begun. It is an elaborate exercise because the tax law is itself a complicated law, and probably there is one of my bosses used to say that there is a limit to which tax law can be simplified. But that said, but one thing one has to be mindful, while we all have a lot of hopes from this exercise, which is fine, but we must understand one thing, that this tax law has been in operation for several years now. It has been constantly interpreted and explained by the department through various instructions, circulars, notifications. It has been interpreted by the courts with every section having now to be understood in a particular way. So whatever simplification we undertake, because we must understand that we are looking at a simplification of language. On the face of it, it is not an amendment of the law. It's basically a simplification of the law as it stands. That's how we generally understand it. Whatever specifics may happen, I'll not get into that. But it's a simplification of the law. So any simplification, whoever is doing that has to take care that it does not disturb the law, that it is...
If we look at the current global macroeconomic situation, we find that advanced economies throughout the world are facing an economic slowdown and an aging population. Compare that with the situation in India. We have India as one of the fastest growing large economies in the world, and a demographic profile of our population which suits us and helps us in leapfrogging in our objective of becoming a developed economy. The Prime Minister of India has made his vision very clear that India should be a developed economy by the 100th year of its independence, which is by 2047. And as India marches forward with a view to achieve this economic objective that we have set for ourselves, the role of taxation in fostering inclusive growth and sustained development.
One is, of course, on the income tax side, how do we increase the tax base? And these are some of the things the government is thinking about or has been thinking about. So the informal sector in the country is the big problem here. The number of people with the disposable income that will be subject to the income tax law of the country. We also see the problem with certain kinds of income that we've had reservations over. So we all know about agricultural income and whether we should tax it, to what extent. Even in agricultural income, the rights, though exist, are exercised only in a very fractional sense with respect to certain crops and not the larger scheme of agricultural income, of course. So those are some of the bigger things. But I actually want to take on your last question and bring it back, because I'm just thinking, and anecdotally, if I were to tell you, I actually lived in Europe just before this last stint in India now, and every time, even when I was in India and I would travel to Europe, the first thing I would do after I land is to take an Uber, and always it's usually a migrant, an immigrant, so he would usually engage in conversation, and I would just say, how are you doing? And they would say, we're very happy. We can see what's happening with our tax money. And that's always something I dwell on in class and outside as well, that how do we improve this? Is it a reputational risk that we have? When we ask classroom students also, they seem to have this sense that, oh, we don't know where our tax money is going. So I'm just going to spin that around and say what we want to aspire for in the coming decades is voluntary tax compliance. And I'd ask if we can in fact nudge more and more towards that through making this link between taxation and spending. We actually do this in India because we have earmarked taxes, and this is not unique to India, because I've done work on this on a global study. We see this is shared experience across the world, but I'd just like to push that idea, because we do earmark. Can we see that as a credibility building exercise? In fact, we have statistics out there in the budgetary documents. So for those of you who are interested, like me, in these questions, we actually have a very good set of documents the government annually puts out. We have a statement of tax revenue foregone. So whenever there is an incentive or such scheme, we see what's happening over there. But we also see an output framework document that's come in, I think, from 2016 onwards. So these are very interesting documents. And therefore, I think we can think about how we can elaborate on this tax spending bridge. So
withholding tax compliance becomes very time consuming for the central tax teams, even after outsourcing because of the multiple rates, because of the multiple exemption limits, the lower tax certificates, and with one vendor having to apply multiple rates. And it also comes with disallowance if you're not able to withhold tax. So our request to the government to consider will be, because all the transactions here on goods, which are already subject to GST and to a registered dealer, and one tax is already captured there, can the same be excluded from a withholding tax perspective? And the government has all the data to capture there. Can we, because the whole idea when the withholding tax came in, there were two themes. One is to collect tax faster, and also that everybody gets into the tax net. Is it possible to look at some of the rates and even out that rate across all the sections to make it simpler for technology to implement and simpler for the compliances, including look at some of the requirements like TDS certificates, issuance, when everything is kind of online, streamlined, can we do away with some of those aspects? When it comes to GST compliances, one of the biggest pain as of today here is DRC 01s, or the notices that we get every day in every state asking for reconciliations. The tax office data itself says that more than 95% is RICO data, 5% is kind of merit issues or the contentious issues under the law. So when we look at simplification, I think GST is a step ahead, and if got an opportunity, I'll talk more about it. Government knows they need to resolve that. IMS could be a step further. How we get some of those reconciliations as part of the GST return filing process itself, so that technology can take care of it and we can avoid some of those multiple notices in the states. So two themes for me: how to simplify audits and investment of times in the audits when we continue to invest in technology, and another is withholding tax.